This episode is sponsored by Magic Mind and Wix Studio.
When is the last time you listened to a podcast about web development, web design, and small business and didn't fall asleep? Yes, we cover web development, web design, and small business, but like actual human beings with personalities. If you're a beginner, we're not going to talk over your head. It's more like asking your buddy for help. We have guests, we have fun, and let me tell you, these two can get off on a tangent. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to HTML All the Things Podcast. This is Matt Lawrence and Mike Curran.
That's right, everybody. We are back, and this is the HTML All the Things Podcast. This episode has not been titled yet. And that is because it is time, once again, for a Mike blind episode, if you will. It's a episode in which I ask a bunch of questions, or at the very least, bring up conversational topics that Mike has not heard about prior to this day. So he does not know what the topic is today at all. And so I'm going to be, asking some questions, proposing some sort of topics to discuss. So if this sounds interesting to you, even though it's completely obfuscated from you, and you want to support the show, you can go and check us out on that Patreon. Leave a review or rating on your podcast app. Join us on our Discord server, or share this with your friends. And now I'm going to reveal the topic. So what I want to discuss today is sort of the end of the line, if you will, for a problem. So you're coding along, you're doing your thing. You hit a problem. So the very first thing you're probably going to do is open up Google, maybe ChatGPT these days. You're going to start Googling things. You're going to start researching things. You're going to start, corroborating things with ChatGPT, going through the regular sort of troubleshooting steps. And it's a meme at this point that it feels really good to close all those tabs, right? Because you find something that could be the problem. Okay, you keep that tab open, you open a new tab, you start Googling again, and you rinse and repeat over and over and over again. And depending on how quickly you solve the problem, how difficult it is to solve it, more or less, you just keep opening tabs and doing this. And then eventually you find the solution. Whether you find the solution on one of those tabs or a combination of them, you find the solution, you implement it, it works, it's a big sigh of relief, and you close all the tabs. But there's a lot of stuff that goes on in between the beginning and the end. One might say it's the journey, not the destination. Because what I want to discuss here is, as you're troubleshooting, as you're going through things, it starts becoming a little bit worrisome that what you're doing, or at least it does to me, that what you're doing is becoming too complex. That what you're doing is ballooning in scope. Maybe it's ballooning in performance problems, ballooning in bad code. We start worrying, oh my God, is this spaghetti code? And this is often because, at least in my experience, is because when I look at a problem in my mind, I know that if it's a big problem, I'll eventually have to break things down. But sometimes one of those problems, whether it's a piece of one or the overarching problem, it ends up being a heck of a lot more complex than I originally thought. And you start using a whole bunch of different things. So I'll give you an example. So just the other day, I started, working on a page and working in Webflow specifically because the client site is on Webflow. Start working away on it, whatever. All of a sudden I hit a problem and I go, okay, it's not a problem as in I'm stuck on something. It's not a problem like I'm troubleshooting. It's a problem as in Webflow doesn't do this and I need the site to do this. So I start looking up ways to do it. I ask ChatGPT, I ask Google, I start combining ideas. I start putting things together. And I eventually go down this road and where all of a sudden, my UI detection method, so I'm, detecting divs in a certain way, is no longer good enough. Because I can't just wait for the page to load, because the plugin that's populating the page just sort of does it whenever it can. And so the page load sort of event gets fired too early oftentimes. And so I have to put in not just a listener like you would on, say, a form item where you're trying to see if someone's changed the input on a form element. I'm talking an actual, I had to use I think it was called a mutation listener or something like that, where I'm watching a div for a mutation. And this was so far beyond the scope. First of all, I've never used one of these mutation things. And it's so far beyond the scope in which I thought this sort of issue would take me. And so I started thinking to myself, okay, is this getting too complex? Is this code becoming spaghetti code? Is adding this, mutation thing, and yes, I'm saying it wrong because I'm just saying it from memory, but as adding this mutation thing, a superfluous step? Is this too hard on the CPU? Is this too difficult? Is this adding too much load time? And sort of the thoughts start to kind of race. And this happened not just recently, which was the scenario I just mentioned. This happened before too. So Mike, like a few weeks ago, you and I were working on something and I was showing you stuff and I kept saying to you, like, is this code, all messed up? What I had done is same thing. It's the same project. I had taken, what Webflow could do, and then I kind of augmented it. And you told me, you're like, no, man, like, we're developers. We use a lot of conditional statements, lots of loops, like you're good. Because I had used a heck of a lot of loops. But as I'm going through these processes, I'm worried about the elephant in the room, the balloon in the room, where is what I'm doing, too superfluous? Is it too big? Is it too complex? And then that ends up playing into my solution as well. And more specifically, it starts to slow me down. So Mike, I want to kind of like ask you about this just kind of in general, and I have a few questions as well I can ask, if the conversation kind of goes there. But what do you think about this particular sort of case? Like, do you see this often? What do you think about this? Because if you're completely new to something, like that mutation thing in JavaScript, where I was completely new to it, waiting for the page or specifically waiting for this particular div to sort of mutate, right, and have its inner HTML, its contents change, that was completely new to me. And so I have no idea if that's performant, if it's this or it's that. And sure, I can just copy paste it and have it work. But I'm worried, like, okay, I'm not really familiar with this. So how much, I guess that's the question, is what I could ask, is, how much of your time when you're in one of these situations where you're constantly Googling, looking things up, asking ChatGPT, trying to figure things out, at what point do you just say, okay, I'm just going to, throw everything at the wall and figure this out and just get this to work, even if it's garbage? Or do you have to sort of take a step back and you need to be sort of more like me, where I do just sort of copy paste things, test things out, manipulate things, see what sticks, but I'm also constantly conscious as to that sort of ballooning potential problem in the background?
I think it's a good mindset to have, to be cautious about the implementations that you're using and to be curious about that. I think that's a good mindset to have. I think rather than just using something and forgetting about it all the time and just allowing yourself to continually kind of piggyback on other people's code without diving into it ever, that could lead to some issues. I agree. What I will say, though, is in situations where we're doing little web development tasks of like, showing and hiding divs on a page, very simple front-end development task, let's say. The idea that a implementation that works could all of a sudden balloon and explode on you because of performance, it's very unlikely, because of how usually low stakes it is to add a couple extra loops in here to iterate over a couple of elements. Even if you screw that up and it iterates over them 5 extra times, to the end user, they're never going to know the difference. And in that situation, like, do you really need to refactor that in the future? Not really. Where it starts to become a problem is from an architecture perspective. So when you get into a situation where you're not solving problem after problem of little things like troubleshooting issues, smaller things like smaller website stuff, but you're going and architecting an application that's meant to be used by thousands, if not millions of users at the same time, then you start to get into the trap of, if you're only copy and pasting and if you're not diving deeper into the actual implementations and how you're implementing the algorithms, how you're, are you double looping? Is that going to double loop over 10,000 elements now? Then it's something where you really need to slow down, take a step back, and start to learn all the different kind of optimizations you can. Having said that, even in that situation, you're still going to do stuff inefficiently sometimes. Like, it's just reality. And you're still going to get away with it because of how performant people's devices are these days, right? Like, the fact that someone's, cell phone in their hands is now 10 times, 20 times as powerful as someone's computer was, 10, 15 years ago, has a big impact on the efficiency of the code that we write. We can be more inefficient. Look at the gaming industry. Look at how graphics and stuff are handled now. When we're developing a game, AAA title, we don't care about your RAM. We don't care about using processors like, we'll just ramp it up. Like just crank all the sliders. We're not optimizing. We know that you have, a good graphics card. So we're going to develop for a good graphics card, and we don't really care. And yeah, that in particular case has a negative impact on users because some people don't have a good graphics card. Some people don't have the right optimized system to play these AAA titles that are coming out that are unoptimized, right? And that's an extreme case. With the web, it's less likely. There's just not as much you can do that will have a very significant detrimental effect on the end user. Yes, you can write stuff more efficiently. Yes, you should start looking at that again when you start architecting larger systems. But I don't think it should stop you from, fixing issues quickly, from going at and building little features here and there, building small applications. Like the reality is that most people's SaaS businesses are going to be used by a couple hundred people at best. Like that's good. That's a good scenario. You're never going to have a situation where you have millions of people on your application. So do you need to write every piece of code efficiently? Not really.
And honestly, like inefficiencies, like you were saying, double looping, things like that. I mean, a lot of that stuff actually does come, at least from my experience, it is copy pasting, but a lot of it is from using ChatGPT, where ChatGPT will, if you give it sort of a long form problem where you give it like lots of parameters, it'll mistake one of your sentences for, oh, it works like this. And even though the end result may be correct, it'll actually be like, adding conditional statements and redundant code in a few places where it really doesn't. Like in my case, I remember I told it, hey, I have a maximum of 3 columns, and it took that to mean, oh, I need to, define a maximum 3 column thing in my JavaScript. When in reality, I'm just telling it how it's laid out on the HTML and the CSS. That part's already done. I just need something to manipulate the contents within these three columns. I don't need you to go in and, look at a maximum of 3 columns. Like it's useless in that regard. I guess like a follow-up question then is you mentioned sort of like a simple sort of front-end task. So when I'm working on customizing any sort of no-code tool, Elementor is a common one, Webflow, like I said, I almost always, or I should say always to this point, use vanilla code, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. That's just what I use, mostly because it just works right in the sort of like embed elements or in the code section, the custom code sections. Is anything under that umbrella considered simple? Like, what do you mean by simple? Obviously, some things are obviously complex and some things are obviously simple, but approximately where would you put that line of, hey, you don't really need to worry too much?
Yeah, I think, again, like when you're customizing a Webflow site, for instance, you're customizing a fairly static website to do something that's maybe less static, right? Like give it some interaction, extend its capabilities. So simple might be the wrong word for that, but that to me doesn't scream that you need to write super efficient code, if that makes sense. First of all, Webflow has its limitations on its own for like just how many things can show up on a page and how many people can even access a Webflow site at the same time. Like Webflow has its own, paywalls that you have to worry about. Whereas your code, like the chances of, 1 million people accessing that web page, hitting your code and having your code be the bottleneck are very low, right? It's something else down in the Webflow internals is probably going to bottleneck you before your, code that displays or hides something or changes the layout of a page slightly, whatever. It's most likely not going to affect it. So anytime you're extending a no code tool, I think I would lean towards the side of that's where you can, it's not the most important thing to architect that feature out and worry about every single piece of code that you write in terms of efficiency. I'd more, solve the problem and move on in that situation, just because it's kind of limiting as well. Like like you said, you're coding inside of a text editor essentially on the Webflow site. You can't really utilize any of the coding tool like IDE tools that allow you to write better code for the most part, right? Like, you don't have TypeScript support. You don't have any any linting, you have nothing to really help you. So in those situations, it's like, just write the code as best you can and hope for the best, like test it, move on.
And with that, like that's something I wanted to ask was, with testing, we obviously have like a fair bit of tools, like the dev tools within a browser are fairly complex, fairly complete. You can mess with the performance tab. You can mess with things like slowing down the data connection to things like 3G, slow 3G, things like that. Should you really be messing with that, you think? Because I mean, the JavaScript and such is going to be, unless it's really, really large, it's going to be kilobytes. It's text, right? At the end of the day. And so it's going to download really quick. And then the person's device, I mean, like, do you need to go get an old device? Because I know that some people are going to, like, I don't even worry about it that much, right? I'm not going to go and try to get like an old device and try to get things going. But I do worry when my fans like kind of kick up, even on my computer. And I know x86 is like notorious on Windows, right? Where you'll be doing something really simple like, I'm going to go to this like news website, and let's say you do have an ad blocker. So a lot of the ads, the auto-playing videos and stuff are not playing. They're not transcoding and all that. Your Windows computer will just spin up and just start, kind of going ham. My previous 2 laptops, which were both gaming laptops, fully capable of running AAA titles. Speaking of AAA titles, they will spin up just in the browser. And sometimes you'll go play a game and it'll spin up to the same decibel level. Like, it's ridiculous, right? And so, like, I'm sure there are some people out there like me who, the instant I hear my computer spin up, even a little bit, I'm like, oh my God, like, I've engaged the computer. Like, I've gone too far. But at the end of the day, I suppose you also need to look at, like, hey, you are using, these people's devices. Like, what's your take on that? Like, how much should you get into? Like, I know you said test things, obviously do that, make sure things work, make sure things aren't just, the page is constantly loading or something like that and eventually crashes because you have like recursion out of control or something in your code. So is there sort of a metric or a set of metrics that you would recommend that people actually go in and like mess with performance-wise, check things? Or is it just like, give it a once over, maybe have an old phone or something at the most, try that out, and then that's it?
I mean, if we're strictly speaking about extending no code tools at this point, right? Like if we're strictly speaking about opening up that embedded code browser and changing some stuff, unless you're doing like a, client side fetch in there of data, then you're not going to have pretty much any impact on the network tab. So as long as you've tested network before, right? Like if you built the site yourself and you presented it to the client, before you present to the client, a lot of times you would test lower speeds and make sure that they works okay. You would do a page speed test, right? Most likely the code that you write isn't going to affect that. Again, unless you're fetching 1,000 items or like 1,000,000 items from a store or something like that. Anyway, which is a possibility. Like you could be doing that. So in that case, like if you're fetching inside of that little embedded code editor, yes, maybe run a quick speed test, see if it had any impact and move on. Whether you would test with a slow device, that's a good question. I guess it depends who your target audience is. If your target audience is everyone under the sun, or maybe your target audience is, the older generation, your target audience is the people, less tech savvy people, right? Like you're not building a tech product, you're building a government sponsored product or something. In that case, then it really starts to matter. It really starts to matter that your website works efficiently, more efficiently than before, because most likely, the older generation is going to have older technology. So maybe getting out an old phone and just running it quickly on that to make sure everything works does make sense. Honestly, like that is a good perspective. If you're building a small SaaS app or you're helping someone with their small website that's not targeting, the World Wide Web, like the entire audience, and it's targeting more techie people, that is a case where you probably don't need to worry about it as much. The other aspect of this is like, you should probably test it across browsers, right? Whatever JavaScript you write could work on one browser and not work on another the same way. So that's probably something that you do want to add to your suite of tests. Just, test it in Firefox, test it in Safari if you can, stuff like that. That's more relevant to the discussion. Something that you mentioned as well, that like, you wait for a page and then all of a sudden it crashes because there's an infinite loop in there, a recursion problem. That is something to consider, because I've had that happen before where I think, a loop will end, but it doesn't. Tough one to test, because it could happen that until you could be fine for 30 minutes, depending on what kind of recursion's happening. You could be fine for 5 seconds. So maybe it's a good idea to leave the website up and running if you have some loops like that you're worried about, and just check in on it every once in a while. Put a console log in there. That's another good way of testing, like console log your loops and, show the iteration counts. If it all of a sudden in the console logs, you see number go up infinitely, you know there's a problem. So just having those little checks, nothing that takes too much time in place is going to help you, especially if you're worried about like a while one loop or like a while for or while whatever. While if those ones you want to particularly be careful with, like a for loop is probably going to end, although it's conditional. So again, something you probably want to check anyway. So those are the kind of the standard things. Nothing too crazy. Again, the impact you're going to have is probably not going to be that much on the performance of the website, honestly, because the no code tools have so much overhead on top of it. Like your little 2 kilobytes of JavaScript that you wrote, yeah, you're not gonna have an impact.
It's weird to think of it, right? Because one of the things that I always worry about is, oh my God, like I'm adding so much code. Like, you know, I thought this was going to be a couple of loops, maybe a conditional statement, and it ends up being, you know, this mutation chain. They got to have like a whole bunch of these, check at this interval, check this, check that, go over here, do this, do that, you know, left, right, up, down, center. And then you start worrying about how much code that you've added, meaning like, you know, what the character count is now, what the line count is. But when you think about it just as text, which we've done twice this episode, it's much better. It's just sort of like, oh, you know, it's 2 kilobytes, 10 kilobytes, 11 kilobytes, whatever it is. We're talking kilobytes, right? We're not talking megabytes, we're not talking gigabytes here. And so, you know, even those on a dial-up connection, you know, aren't going to be affected too poorly, you know, by a kilobyte or two. I mean, things have been kilobytes and much larger than kilobytes for many, many years. And I mean, many people upload files, like meaning like literally images and things like that, that are much, much, much larger, you know, that could be compressed. And a lot of websites just don't do it because, you know, maybe they're misinformed or they want the high quality or whatever it is. And so, you know, that obviously plays into that too. And so the sort of takeaway from this particular kind of answer is to kind of check your code, not check the amount of code. Because I know that the amount of code is obviously still like a worry that a lot of people, myself included, as I've mentioned, you know, will have. But realistically speaking, unless it's like, you know, you've added 1 million lines to check if like a heading is present, maybe it's like, hey, hang on, we should be, you know, maybe doing this a little bit more efficiently. And chances are that would get caught in a peer review if you are getting your code checked via peer review. But I just want to take this one quick second to talk about MagicMind really quick. So what have I been doing this week? Well, the last I'm going to say 2 weeks or so, I have just been golfing my ass off on the weekends, been going super early, and I'm a fool. So I stay up super late, like 4 a.m., get up at 7, then go golfing. That's really smart for a physical activity. And I'm really tired. When I first get up, it's really, you know, kind of rough. It's whatever. And, you know, I will still try to have my coffee in the morning, but sometimes I can't make it. And so what I'll do is I'll go into the cupboard, quickly grab a MagicMind or two, because I've actually been sharing this with a couple of my golf buddies. You know, grab a couple of the MagicMind shots, go to the golf course, of course, head up in the cart, jump into the cart and be like, hey man, I have this like sort of little energy shot. Do you want to try it? And boom, you know, we're kind of good for the rest of the round. I will sometimes also combine this with coffee, like I said, in the morning, and I'm just completely alert for the entire round. Even when I, you know, stay up to 4 a.m., get up at 7, it's only 3 hours of sleep. And realistically, I'm not a machine. I don't fall asleep right away. So we're, you know, 2.5, 3, maybe 4 hours of sleep. It's a little bit rugged sometimes. And one thing I have noticed actually is that when my golf buddies are, you know, sometimes they'll be drinking coffee or whatever, drinking sugary drinks, they'll even like kind of put it down, right? They'll take a bad shot or something. They'll put it down and be like, okay, you know, this is too much. Like I'm getting too jittery. I'm getting too stressed out. I'm getting too, you know, sort of that caffeine jitters, the caffeine high, if you will. They're getting too much of that. Whereas every time I've given them a MagicMind, they've never complained. They've never gone like, man, I'm jittery. I'm too anxious. I'm too whatever. We don't have that. You go out there. It's nice and calm. You just do it, and that's it. And honestly, I know this is a MagicMind ad, but I honestly do believe that it is the key to golf is just to remain calm, which is very difficult for me as I am a very high-strung person. But, I mean, it's honestly just a training exercise. And you, yourself, can go out there, grab yourself some MagicMind with 20% off. You can go out there, go hit some golf balls on the golf course and hopefully do well because you'll be calm. You won't be jittery. You won't be, you know, bouncing off the walls, if you will. And you can do that with our code. So you can get 20% off one-time purchases and subscriptions up to 20% off with HTML Pod 20. That's the code, HTML Pod 20. No spaces, no commas, no nonsense. HTML Pod 20. That's all in capitals. And remember to use that code at our link, magicmind.com/HTML Pod 20. That link and that code will be in the show description as well as in the show notes on htmlallthethings.com. And I'd like to add one other thing. I'm going to tease this. I'm going to tease it. we have something coming up soon. It's only going to be only available for 10 users. I'm going to say no more, but you better listen to all our episodes to catch it, because if you're a Magic Mind fan, you're going to want to get in on this 10 user offer that's coming up in a future episode, hopefully very, very soon. But that's it. I'm not going to say anything else. But what I am going to talk about, Mike, is more about coding, because what I want to say is, okay, so we've talked about sort of embedding code into those sort of embed elements, into those sort of embed areas in these web site builders, whatever, right? WordPress, the list goes on, right? We got a whole bunch of those. Now, the main kind of question, I guess, that I have is like, okay, sometimes you go into those little areas, it's a small text box, it starts getting pretty cumbersome in there. You're like, okay, this sucks. You start sort of like taking your thing out, you start putting it into a file, you start calling that in, okay? I've been told in the past that that is too superfluous, that I shouldn't be doing that on projects that specifically have areas for code. And this might just be totally personal preference or whatever. It might be totally hearsay, urban legend, might be nonsense, who knows? But I've heard that, where it's like, hey, keep custom code in the custom code box. Don't be, in the custom code box calling an external file, because that's, dangerous. It's too much. It's too superfluous, whatever. Like, what do you think on that? Like, I think that's kind of nonsense. Like, it's easier sometimes to work in a custom file. And honestly, for organization, especially if it's an optional thing, if someone just goes, I actually don't want to filter like this anymore, and it's all done in custom code, they can just take away my file, and then that's it.
I think this comes down to, like a design principle, or a principle that you have set for your project. I think some people want all of their code that's affecting their pages to be located in those text boxes, because then in the future, if that's what they stick to on this project, and they stick to on every project, if they need to go back 3 projects, they know where the code is. They go click on the text box, done. But the same thing could be said for someone that would prefer to just use a custom file. And if they use that on every project, or they use that, let's say like, okay, if it exceeds 20 lines of code, I go custom file. If they know that, if that's their rule, then they have the exact same kind of principle that they can come back to 3 years down the line. If they've been using the same thing, they go back and they check out a file, because they know that this one was a little bit longer. So it comes down to preference. This is a preference thing. Now, having said that, I think there's some real big benefits from using a file versus just the embedded editor, because what you can do is you can just open up a traditional IDE, you could set up a project in there, and you can have all of your custom files be located in that project, and maybe even a dummy little web page that you can target and test on, rather than building it all in a live editor. Now, for some features, this might not be possible, because you're relying on 10 different things inside of the no-code tool, so whatever. Maybe simple features are very uncoupled from the no-code editor. You could do all of your actual development work inside of your IDE, like a traditional development environment. Have a test environment set up in there that doesn't rely on the no-code tool, and then just literally take that file, adapt it to however you need to adapt it, and put it into wherever you need to put it in on the no-code tool to reference to it. I personally would probably prefer that, because I think working in that little text box would drive me absolutely up the wall if it's anything other than like a really quick 5-line fix, but it's a personal preference thing.
Well, you made one good point too, is that you can go and code in a natural environment. And if you're just trying to, make the heading spin around in circles for some reason, you could make your own heading on some random index file, right? Random, literally index.html, throw a heading on there, and then have your JavaScript go and make it spin around, right? Make sure it works, make sure whatever. And then just make sure that you adapt it to the no-code tool, which sounds like it's going to be like a lot more productive and a lot faster, because working in the little box is one thing, but oftentimes you have to keep publishing. Make a small change, you publish. You wait for the publish to happen, you go refresh on another tab. Okay, it isn't working. Back to the box, right? And so it's not exactly like the most, I guess, convenient or productive development environment. It's not as simple as just going in and being like, okay, like I'm going to, make all these changes, make all these fixes, and I'm going to have like a listener or whatever automatically compile it, get it all ready, and reload it like you will with a lot of like modern frameworks, right? Whereas if you just make these simple plugins and all you have to do is quickly refresh on that index.html, it's not as close to like this auto reload thing, but it's a far cry from the sort of Okay, save my changes. Now press publish. Now go to an in private tab. Go to the link. Okay, it didn't work. Back to the editor. Click the thing. Open the box. Doesn't sound like it's a lot of work. You know, a lot of people will be like, oh, you're being lazy. Not being lazy. Like it's adding time. So if you have to do that 40, 50 times, you know, it's adding maybe 5 or 10 minutes, you know, over the course of a day. And so it is a lot of time, and, you know, it's annoying as well. That's a good point. If possible, you can make your development environment as close to sort of a traditional development environment as you can, because those are more or less built for speed. I do have another question here as well, and in particular one. So one of the things that I struggle with when I'm manipulating sort of websites with a fix like this doesn't have to be a no-code tool. This could be anything. This could be any sort of a development environment. What I mean is that something is generating the page. So whether it's a no-code tool, whether it's a coded up thing, the page is all divvied up. So, or I'll keep on saying developed up. That's so stupid. Like, why would I say it's developed up? It's just there. The page is there. It's ready to go. And let's just, for example, it's a title, subtitle, and 3 bullet points. Real easy. But for some reason, the absolute maximum is 2 bullet points. For whatever reason. And so I go, okay, we gotta kill that 3rd bullet point. That's super simple in JavaScript, right? You go in there, hopefully there's a class on the bullet points, you kill the 3rd one in the array, you know, once you get the items by class name. And that's basically it. That's what I would do. My question though, Mike, is how much of a cop-out is that? So this is something that I kind of struggle with sometimes, where I kind of think to myself, okay, like that 3rd bullet point in our example shouldn't be there. You know, how much should I worry about killing that 3rd bullet point from the source and having it never be generated versus going in after and being like, the page gets generated, you know, and that original program thinks the page is done. And then I'm coming in and being like, actually, we're removing that 3rd bullet point. Like, is that a Band-Aid fix? Like, is that a cop-out in any way? It feels weird to me to kind of go in there at the 11th hour. Actually, a fantastic example in the real world is WordPress. So WordPress, obviously you have themes, right? They're visual themes, they do their thing. Let's just say, for example, that there's a nav bar in the theme, as most have, and this nav bar is red. That's just the color. And they do not give you a control over the color for whatever reason, right? They just don't have that available to you. So you can go into, there's literally a field called additional CSS, and you can go in there and say, you know, .navbar, make the background color blue instead of red. What WordPress is doing is WordPress is effectively like pumping out, / that theme is pumping it out at red, right? This is how I visualize it in my head. It's pumping it out in red, and then I'm coming in and being like, actually, it's blue. And it just feels like I'm band-aiding it, or I'm like, kind of like, nothing to see, hang on, nothing to see here. It's actually blue. Like, how much should you worry about that when you're coding stuff up? Like, if fixing at the source versus sort of fixing afterwards, what do you think?
Yeah, this one's tough. I think inherently when you decide to use one of these code generation tools, whether it be a no-code tool like WordPress or Webflow, or maybe like something in the middle with like Plasmic or something like that, like anything that generates the code for you at the base level, you're inherently giving away some forms of decisions. They're going to make decisions for you. Now, what I find is a lot of times you can explain that if this is a client job, right? You're doing something for a client. You sit down with them, you have a discussion. Hey, we're choosing Webflow. Here are the common limitations of Webflow. Are you okay with them, right? And they look at it, don't look at it. I don't know. They'll say yes, 99.9% of the time. And then a month later, you've built the site and they come back at you, and they say like, oh, I need that blue. But WordPress only makes it red. And you explained that to them on the day one, but they forgot, they didn't listen, etc. In those situations, yes, it's a Band-Aid fix, but you have no choice. And I think a lot of times the reality is you kind of have no choice but to Band-Aid those problems as they come up, to the point where you're Band-Aiding a lot, you're fixing Band-Aids on top of Band-Aids. And yes, it becomes rickety if you continue to do that. When you get to the point where you're customizing everything, and that can happen, that's when you start thinking about migrating away from this no-code or code generation tool to maybe a more custom solution. If it's one or two things here and there, I don't think that's a problem, personally. I think it's perfectly okay to band-aid that color fix. I think it's okay to, add a third point, remove a third point if it's not supported here and there. If it's every page, every little feature that you're doing it, yeah, you chose the wrong tool, period. So therefore you have to start to think about if there's a budget for it, if there's time for it, start moving to something that's a little bit more customizable, a little bit more extensible, that has less code generation and allows you to move away from these band-aids to a more robust solution, which is just building what you need to build. Or on the other hand, once you start to see this trend of, hey, we need to change this against the rules of the platform, you need to stick up for the platform almost and the choices that were made early on and try to fight back a little bit and be like, hey, we chose Webflow for a reason A, B, and C. Yes, maybe you didn't understand the limitations. That's okay. Here are the limitations again, right? Maybe we need to work around those limitations. And that's okay. Like maybe that third bullet point is okay to stay there. Maybe we don't need to remove it, right? Like those are the conversations you have to have with your client, with your boss, whatever. And if those conversations lead to the fact that, hey, no, we need to customize this, need to customize that, we need to have no limitations, then you should tell them that, hey, like it sounds like we need to move away from this platform in the future. So let's maybe start talking about that as a potential in the next quarter or next month or two, maybe moving to a more custom platform that has no limitations, takes a little bit longer to develop, but at least you can do whatever you want because it doesn't sound like you're okay with having any sort of limitations. That's where you need to draw the line. And that's where you need to try to find that out before you make this decision, before you go down the path of a no-code tool that has limitations. The problem is that until you hit those limitations, a lot of times customers don't understand them, and therefore it's difficult to express and come to that realization. But you should still try your best effort to do that before you get into the problem.
Devs, this one's for you. I've got 30 seconds to tell you about Wix Studio, the web platform for agencies and enterprises. So here are a few things you can do in 30 seconds or less on Studio. Integrate, extend, and write custom scripts in a VS Code-based IDE. Leverage zero setup dev, test, and production environments. Ship faster with an AI code assistant. And work with Wix headless APIs on any tech stack. Time's up, but the list keeps going. Step into Wix Studio and see for yourself. Link in the show description and in the show notes. Well, let me ask you a question then. So if we take it out of the no-code space, but it is something that generates code for you, and it's a tool that's meant to be manipulated. It's supposed to give you sort of a jumping off point. We've used it in the past. Moodle is actually an example of this, where Moodle is like an online school. They have like Moodle Cloud, which is, Moodle itself, the software. It hosts classrooms, it hosts like class, it has like student enrollment, it has all these different features, and you can host it on Moodle Cloud, which is Moodle's own service, where they host it. You basically pay for a plan with, whatever it is, whatever limitations it is, certain amount of bandwidth, certain amount of whatever, and then you run your classes on there, or you can take it self-hosted, and I believe it's open source. And you can go in and you can mess with the core files. You can make plugins for it. You can, again, left, right, up, down, center, whatever. And so Moodle, when it's self-hosted, is more of, let's say, a developer's tool, let's say. So I have an exact example of something that happened here where, we get everything up and running. We're using a few official plugins, that type of thing. Or I don't know how official they were, but plugins anyway. A couple core files are changed, whatever, because we're making a school for the government and they have a lot of very, very, very specific rules they want us to follow. And it gets to sort of the 11th hour, and there's this point where we're told, hey, when this, that, and the other thing happen, we actually don't want that particular student to be able to log back in, period. And it's not necessarily like a hardcore security thing. It's not anything like that. So what I said was like, okay, what we need to do is we need to like put up a facade in the front of it, right? Because this is not a hardcore security thing where we quite literally just take like a big old white div and we cover it up. But then the students got wise to this and they started, kind of taking that away and then logging in from behind, which makes sense. So what I started doing was in my JavaScript, I started taking the inner HTML of the page that was generated, the login page, and I would just completely destroy it. I would just take it, yeet it out the door, so now there's nothing for them to generate, and then I would display my message. Now, the reason why this was done in JavaScript is because Moodle, in this particular case, didn't support this feature. It was something really particular. It was been a number of years now, but it was something like they answer something incorrectly or they reach their time limit for the day or something. It was like they've reached some sort of limit of the day and they get kicked out to a login screen that's actually a relog screen. They're at a force relog for a particular reason. And so it was just like, an edge case. Moodle just doesn't support it. It doesn't support that particular feature. And so my fix worked, like we put it in, but to me, it felt very, very much like a Band-Aid because it was like, well, I'm not going into Moodle core. I'm not writing a plugin that's doing this. I'm just sort of destroying the page with a bit of JavaScript. Once I detect the argument that's like, relog due to timeout or whatever it is, I'm just literally taking the whole page and whoop, there it goes. So unless you know how to like code that page up real quick, certainly some people could figure that out. Again, this is more of a gatekeeping and less a security thing. So like what do you think about stuff like that? Like if you were the developer on this particular project, like, we were at the 11th hour. If you weren't at the 11th hour, would you bother like building a whole plugin? Like there's no Moodle plugin that does this. We would have to build it. And we'd have to figure out exactly how to build a Moodle plugin. Or we would have to build a new version of Moodle, again, because I believe it's open source. We would have to do it, right? We'd have to build this thing out. Or I can go in with a bit of JavaScript and I could just yeet the page. Like what would you do in an official sense?
So yeah, good question. If I was down the path of using something like Moodle for a fairly large project and I had the time, I wasn't at the 11th hour, I think it would make sense to go down the path of learning how to build that plugin. Because I think, yes, initially, yeah, it's an investment of time that's not going to pay off too much. But inevitably, if this project lasts for any amount of time, you're going to need to extend it. And if you learn how to do the plugin the first time, the next time is going to be much easier. And making an official plugin, maybe you put it up on the official plugin store and have it also being used by other developers. Maybe it's open source and you have people contributing to those plugins and fixing bugs and stuff like that, making it more efficient. Like there's a lot of advantages to using the extensibility of a system that provides extensibility in the right way. It allows you to continue to use their support. Like for instance, if you created that little hacky thing, right, and you posted a support ticket online and talk about that, like the chances of someone coming in and helping you because of that hacky thing is going to be lower. Whereas if you use the official supported systems of an open source tool like that, the chances of people coming in and trying to help you are higher. That's the other trade-off here. So again, it's at the 11th hour, I would do exactly what you did. I would get some hacky plugin, hacky JavaScript going to fix it. Any step, like if the project would have continued, right? The next step of that like 11th hour fix would be, how do we make this more extensible? Like how do we make it so that this sticks? How do we make it so that it's more supported and stuff like that? I would always be thinking in that realm, as long as this project is something that I needed to continue to support over the next, years to come. And I was getting paid to support it, obviously. So like it really matters on the context of what's going on around the thing. It's, again, you need to do hacky fixes. It's going to happen, like across the board. Like no matter how official your project is, no matter how many code rules you have, you're going to be pushing up stuff that doesn't follow all the code rules sometimes to make sure that your project is working the way it's supposed to be working. But it's important to follow that up sometimes as well. Like I think pushing that up on a continual basis, like continuing to do hacky fixes after hacky fixes is going to lead to problems in a long-lived project. It's all about like the coding standards, code quality, how to maintain something for a long time. We had an episode on this earlier, code quality episode in general. That's probably a good listen if you're looking to listen to something after this. It is a serious consideration.
The support angle is actually something I never really thought of because I couldn't go to the Moodle forum and be like, hey guys, I threw this random custom line of JavaScript in here or this random function. And I actually wasn't even supposed to be running JavaScript at the time, but I got like the other guy on our team to make it so that JavaScript could run at that time. So it doesn't work. Like I need a bit of help here. People would be like, the hell is all this? And then, I mean, if you get a bite, they might be like, yo man, use a plugin, or they might try to help, but it's a big maybe. That's a really interesting one because I mean, in the WordPress sphere, if you're using like a totally custom solution, you have to almost go, well, I guess you would have to go to the sort of the devs for help, not the devs of WordPress. I mean, you go in and you're like, hey, JavaScript devs, I'm having trouble with this function, right? And then you got to like take their advice and convert it and make it work for your WordPress specific implementation. Whereas if you're using like a WooCommerce, for example, you could be like, hey, WooCommerce doesn't work when I check this box. This box is supposed to make the shipping free. It's not making the shipping free. Why isn't my shipping free? Then someone can come in, including a staffer or a moderator or a support specialist from WooCommerce could actually come in and be like, okay, what's going on here? You know, what are your other plugins? Those type of things. They're not going to be like, hey, are you running, like if I was running a whole bunch of like custom crap manipulating WooCommerce, and then I was like, hey, my WooCommerce isn't working, but by the way, I got all this custom crap. The very first thing they're going to say is, hey man, take that custom stuff out of here. Like, we can't be having, you know, we got to have a control group here. We have to have a way to like begin our troubleshooting and finish our troubleshooting and actually kind of get through it, you know, for that reason. And the final thing I want to discuss, it's just purely about efficiency. So we've talked about, you know, coding efficiency, you know, avoiding going through loops, going through this, going through that. Mike, you mentioned specifically, just sort of looping back to the beginning of the episode, you know, if you're going into something like, you know, manipulating the UI on a website builder of some sort, you're manipulating the UI in that way, typically you don't have to worry. But I want to know, like, when you should worry. Are we worrying more or less on like server side stuff where we're specifically worried about our server side code being really efficient? Is that what we're worried about? When should you start going, okay, I need to take my efficiency very seriously? One thing I can already tell you is obviously if something is very computationally intensive, like if you're doing a lot of image manipulation, obviously you're going to have some optimizations because, you know, not everyone's going to have an amazing graphics card. They're not going to have 3D, blah, blah, blah. The list goes on. But like, the very first thing that I thought of at the beginning of the episode when you mentioned that was, oh, okay, so do I need to worry more about server side? Like, is that what I'm worried about? Can you kind of elaborate on that, where it's like, if I'm in this sort of environment, like if I find myself in an environment where it's like, I'm a full stack dev on this project, I need to be super efficient because I'm touching the server. Like, is that where we're at?
It's not about server. It's about what you're going to be, how much data you're going to be consuming and what you're going to be manipulating, right? It's all about like the interaction you have either with the server or with the data that is already present. Like in a CMS, if there's a million items on a page that you have to filter through, it's very different considerations from 20. And it's also different considerations where like, okay, we have 20 now. In a month, are we going to have 40 or are we going to have 100? And then in a month after that, is that going to grow as well? Like, you need to establish a set of like metrics on what are you affecting? Like, what is this code actually contributing to? Is it contributing to the page showing and hiding a single element? Only ever it's going to show and hide 5 elements, right? In that case, yeah, you don't have to worry about performance and efficiency. You can loop over those 5 elements 1,000 times and it wouldn't matter. It's only 5 elements, right? Like if you wrote a super efficient filtering mechanism for 5 elements and you use the built-in .filter method of a JavaScript array, yeah, you're not going to see a difference. From an end user perspective, they're not going to see a difference between that. But if the filter that you're writing is for today is 5 elements, but tomorrow is 1,000 elements, and the day after that is 10,000 elements, then you're talking about you're writing a scaling method. Like, you need to really consider the data that you're going to be touching, not only today, but tomorrow and the day after. And that's where you start to consider, okay, I need to look into what the most efficient filtering method is here. I need to start looking into, am I double, counting these elements when I don't need to be counting these elements? Because I'm going to be touching 1,000 or 10,000 or a million of them. Or I'm going to be showing and hiding like 1 million of these elements or whatever, right? Like it all depends on the data that you're touching, on the manipulation that you're doing to the data. And it also comes down to different things. So animations, particularly. I think front end, this has nothing to do with server, obviously. But an animation, and you've seen this before, when you open up a site and all of a sudden your graphics card goes crazy, you can write an inefficient animation. Absolutely. And it can look okay, and that's fine. But the reality is it's going to do exactly that. It's going to make your graphics card spin up. And you can go in and write an animation using, the native animation APIs that does the exact same thing and makes the graphics card spin up less. So if you have a lot of animations on a page, not necessarily backend, obviously, that's where you need to start thinking about writing more efficient code as well. There's different ways to animate something, right? Now especially. There's like libraries you can use. There's native APIs you can use. There's just straight CSS animations you can use that all do the same thing. And so those are completely different use cases. Yeah, you can write something really dirty and quickly with something like GSAP, right? And that's a really good animation library. But in certain situations, if you use too much GSAP, for instance, you might have performance issues. So maybe you need to write some of those animations in native, some of those animations in GSAP. Like, you need to start thinking about it from a performance perspective there. So amount of data, animations are a big thing. Showing and hiding elements usually are not going to do much for performance. You don't have to worry about that. When you're talking server side, when you're connecting to a database, that can have performance implications, right? Like, you're connecting to a backend, plus the backend is connected to a database. You're talking about multiple hops. That's where you have to start thinking about some efficiency stuff because of the fact that you might be doing multiple hops for multiple different requests. So for instance, let's say you connect to a backend and the backend needs to fetch all the users, right? Or like a certain subset of users for this page to show. And so the backend goes and fetches that subset of users. But then also you need to fetch a related object on that user called the posts that the user has. So you're displaying a blog. Well, it makes a pretty significant difference if you're going to first request the users, get all their IDs, and then do another separate request to request all the posts for each user, maybe multiple requests. Like if you do a for loop and request every single user in a separate request to get all of their posts, you could be doing, 50, 60 extra requests to your server, to your database and back, when all of that I just mentioned can be done in one request with the right SQL query, right? So that's why the backend becomes a little bit more complex with this efficiency stuff, because even if you're requesting a small subset of issues of items, it could lead to pretty significant slowdowns if you're doing it in an inefficient way.
And price as well, because when you're on the client side of things, you're worried about the client's device having enough computational power to run whatever it is you're doing. You need to worry about that on your server to an extent, but if you're using like a cloud hosting service, you're actually more so worried about like how much computing power you're using, because you're paying whatever it is per second, per minute, per whatever. You're paying at a rate of usage, which is a problem. I mean, it's going to be a problem for you, like no doubt. If you're sending an extra 50 per user, 50 SQL queries, like you said, per user, I mean, that's a lot, right? But if you get it down to one, I mean, you just cut it down so that 50 people, 50 potential leads hit your site, before you pay what you normally would pay for one. And you might be splitting hairs, like we talked about already in this episode. I'm not going to, keep talking about it over and over again, but it's like, we've already talked about how sometimes you need that Band-Aid fix, and maybe that 50 SQL query is not going to cost you that much, and that's a good fix right now, but then in version 2 of the website, you're going to fix it. But yeah, like you're 100% right. Like you have to basically take a look at your situation and where your situation is. Client side, server side, how much does it cost? What is the target audience? All that type of other things that we discussed earlier in the episode as well. But I think, honestly, that's it. That's all my questions. This was, again, a blind episode. Mike went into this completely blind, had no idea what the heck he was going to be talking about today. Mike, give me a review. What did you think about this episode's topic?
Yeah, I think it's an important one, honestly. Like, I think a lot of these questions, I think people are going to have on a very consistent basis. So hopefully I answered some of them. Again, I'm blind to it. I think I did a decent job, but let me know. I'm on X/Twitter, HTML, everything. If you want to, come at me where I got stuff wrong, I'm perfectly okay with admitting that. Or if you thought some of what I said was useful, yeah, let me know, because I thought it was a good episode. I think these questions are pretty universal. I think a lot of people, even people that maybe are just traditional devs or not traditional devs, will work with those kinds of like thoughts and like, do I do stuff inside the embedded editor? Do I not? How much do I need to do there? Do I need to worry about efficiency? It's all very, very relevant to a lot of people out there. And I think I've done this enough times to answer that confidently at this point.
No, I'd say the answers were definitely satisfactory. Like definitely really, really good. Like I got a lot of good insight, and like it added to, I only had like 3 or 4 questions realistically jotted down, and we ended up doing way more than that. So no, hands off to you as well, sir. Hats off to you. Pat on the back. I hate that pat on the back stuff though. I don't like that.
I'm doing it right now.
God. Someone told me to do that the other day. They said, give yourself a pat on the back. I was like, I'm good. I think, actually, don't like it. I don't know. That's like we've talked about that in another episode, but not a fan. Anyway, what I am a fan of is our Patreon, because our Patreon supports episodes like this. And if you would like to support episodes like this, you can go and check us out on Patreon. That's patreon.com/HTML, all the things. And if you would like a shout out at the end of the episode with your websites, you can say your business name or your personal name and your website, please do it. It's $3. Go check it out. I'm not sure how the conversion all works on Patreon, but we've set it to $3. So go check that out. But it's now time to name our $3 tier patrons. Tim from the Web Hacker on thewebhacker.com, Jason from Geek Life Radio via geekliferadio.com, Garrett Segal, Level Up Financial Planning via www.levelupfinancialplanning.com, Joshua via silvio.us, and Magnus from YesWeb via yesweb.se. And remember, go and get your Magic Mind. Get up to 20% off with our code and our link. It's HTMLpod20, and our link is magicmind.com/HTMLpod20. That will be in the show description as well as in the show notes. And we'd like to give a shout out to Michael LaRocca, a contributing author on HTMLallthethings.com. Michael is the author of Self-Taught, the X Generation blog at selftaughttxg.com. Feel free to leave a comment or a review on the platform that you are listening to this on, and this outro will sign us off.
You've been listening to HTML All the Things Podcast. Web development, web design, and small business. We hope you've gotten some useful and practical information from this show. And we hope you appreciate that we talk to you like human beings. And we hope you had some fun. We'll be back soon. But in the meantime, hit us up on social media. On Facebook, Instagram, and Patreon at HTML All the Things. And on Twitter at HTML Everything. Until next time, this is HTML All the Things, signing off.